Well, welcome everybody. I'm thrilled that you can all be here for this, the third seminar in our series on alternative data governance and alternative data economies. My name is Jake Goldenfein. I'm a senior lecturer here at Melbourne Law School and an investigator at the Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society. Before moving on and talking about the series, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that the place where I work and where I sit now is on unceded Wurundjeri land, and I want to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians from the Woiwurrung and Boiwurrung language groups and the Kulin Nations. And I am also presently sitting and working in a law school, and I want to take a moment to think about the role of law and legal instruction and practice has had in the continuing process of colonization. And I similarly want to reflect on the significance of our topic, data governance, and the way in which data governance is implicated in these questions of colonization and sovereignty. Now, today's seminar theme is organizations and intermediaries in the digital economy. This is the third in a series that has so far looked at in our first seminar with Katerina Pistor and Salome Villiern. We looked at how we might reconfigure our understandings of data to achieve more desirable social relations in the digital economy. In our second seminar with Julie Cohen and Kian Birch, we explored the ways in which platforms have superseded or transcended the idea of markets and called into question current regulatory trajectories of trying to turn the digital economy into a more competitive marketplace. And today we're going to explore the role of organizations and intermediaries as a point of leverage for building new kinds of economic arrangements and rearranging power relations between different actors online, as well as thinking about what that means for the professions and for the professions involved in building these kinds of organizations. So these seminars are organised by the Australian Research Council funded Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society, or ADM+S as we call it, along with our partner organisations, the Humanising Machine Intelligence Project at the Australian National University and the Centre for AI and Digital Ethics based at Melbourne Law School at the University of Melbourne. And I now wish to introduce Professor Jeannie Paterson, Director of the Centre for AI and Digital Ethics, whose work investigates the role of consumer law and contract law and other species of private law in the regulation and ethics of artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies, and who is a wonderful interlocutor, thinker, and colleague. And I'll ask Jeannie to introduce the speakers and chair today's session. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jake, for the introduction, and thank you to our panel and our audience for being here for a really interesting discussion. The title of today's seminar is Organisations and Intermediaries in the Data Economy, but we could have more colloquially named that Who's Creating Value, Who's Left Out, and What Do We Do About That? So we're really fortunate to be joined by two people who've thought long and hard, as well as Jake himself, in fact, about how we perhaps think about different structures for ownership, how we encourage a shared interest in democratisation and adding ethical and perhaps also environmental or sustainability values to the market, through structures that are generative rather than extractive. So I'm very pleased to introduce, first of all, Professor Bronwen Morgan, who's a Professor of Law at the University of New South Wales. And Bronwen's renowned for her work on transformations of the regulatory state at both national and transnational contexts. And she has a particular interest in the interaction between technocratic entities of regulation and collective commitments to democracy, conviviality, and ecological sustainability. Bronwen's current work focuses on new legal platforms for social enterprise and also the changing demands that will be made on professionals in working in this environment. So thanks for joining us, Bronwen. We're also joined from the US at, I don't know, hate to think what hour, by Nathan Schneider, who's a journalist and an assistant professor at the University of Colorado. He writes about religion, technology, and democracy. And his current project is an exploration of models for democratic ownership and governance for online platforms, with a particular interest in platform cooperativism. And Nathan has written widely in both popular media and otherwise, and he's also the founder of the Media Enterprise Design Lab. So thank you so much for joining us, Nathan. Now, I thought we would just begin by setting the scene a little bit. I'm sure that everybody in this audience is aware of the impact of surveillance capitalism, or what Julie Cohn, a couple of seminars ago, described as information capitalism. So we're facing pervasive tracking, collection of personal data, sophisticated analytics to find value in that data, and its use to predict, influence and control behaviour of consumers and global citizens. Now, this data transaction between individuals and digital platforms is typically perceived in contractual terms. So we hear about contracts for data, contracts for privacy, and the like. Now, this places responsibility on individuals for the uses of data. And increasingly, the efficacy and fairness of this approach has been challenged. And in response, we see moves in the regulatory state to impose more substantive concerns of fairness or fiduciary obligations, even on data controllers, and discussions about how to break up or refashion the market power of the platforms through antitrust interventions. But there's another strand of really important work that's taking place about the roles of new intermediaries, like trusts or co-ops, that might stand between platforms and users and represent, as I mentioned, a more democratic and ethical, sustainable form of use. So this is a discussion we want to have today. And I thought we'd start with Nathan. Nathan, you've thought and written and talked a lot about these issues. Can you talk a little bit about the attraction of alternative intermediary structures, as opposed, for example, to relying on stronger laws or better reinforced regulators to control the excesses of platform power?
Thank you. Yeah, I first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to be part of this conversation. It's really something I've been looking forward to. But I wouldn't say that it's an either or. You know, I think we need both. We need a framework that encourages accountability one way or another. And part of that, I think, can be the recognition that not all that accountability should come straight from the state, that we want to build accountability into the structures in diverse ways of the entities that we're building. And this, I think, really will require a regulatory framework, as cooperative structures of the past have needed. But that if we also enable space for people to be creative about their accountability and democracy, really cool things can happen. And one reason for that, the need for that creativity, is that platforms are so diverse. For instance, the kind of data stewardship, the kind of cooperative structures one might want for a rideshare labor company are very different from what you might want from a personal data company like Facebook. Facebook, you might want more oversight and control over what is done with your data. With something like a rideshare company, the priority might be on financial benefits. And so we need a framework that encourages appropriate models and invites creativity of communities and entrepreneurs and regulators and others to find the right models for the diverse, creative, interesting cases and challenges that we have before us.
Okay, I'm going to just, before I move on, I'm just going to push you a little bit on this idea of diversity and different models. I mean, surprising to me to raise this question, but if we took a sort of hardline economic approach or efficiency approach, wouldn't we say that intermediaries, particularly when we're talking about, you know, different kinds of intermediaries for different markets, don't we just increase transaction costs, which ultimately don't benefit consumers and citizens?
I'd have to think about that. I tend to think that we have diverse models, and if we try to apply a kind of one-size-fits-all solution on them, we're going to see greater transaction costs. We're going to see a kind of greater friction. So, I'd like to hear more about those concerns, but I tend to think that we want to invite not just the creativity of our profit-seeking entrepreneurs, but the creativity of our accountability-seeking democratic entrepreneurs. And it's that latter kind that I think we are not incentivizing as in our societies and in our tech economies, while we are very actively and aggressively incentivizing the former.
Yeah, so in a sense, we've got a one-size-fits-all at the moment. This is the model for innovation as opposed to something else, which relies on profit extraction rather than any other perhaps purpose. So, Jake, I'm going to actually pull you in here because you've also thought and written hard about these issues. And in particular, many of us will have seen your piece in response to suggestions during, I have to say, the first COVID wave for cell phone tracking, and the question about who should be responsible for location data for managing COVID spreads. Now, you wrote about this idea that it's not an either or, but there's actually different models we might like to think about. For example, data cooperatives, which may also facilitate trust in those types of tracking technologies for public purpose benefits. Would you like to talk a little bit here then about the attraction of thinking, as Nathan has said, about creativity and alternative models?
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for including me. I'm certainly not as expert as Bronwen or Nathan, but I suppose I can chime in a little bit. You're referring to the piece in Jacobin where called "Privacy versus Health is a False Trade-off." That was a piece I co-wrote with Salome Billion and Ben Green. And I suppose it comes back to this question you recently asked about whether or not something like an intermediary imposes transaction costs. And I think part of what we're arguing there is that irrespective of the transactions costs involved, and inevitably there will be transaction costs involved associated with new business, technological, legal design for intermediaries like that, what we're really talking about is trying to institute a different system of social relations, because the idea that we're individuals and we have like this privacy that we then have to give up for some sort of public purpose is, I think, a kind of dichotomy that we want to move away from. And instead, how can we have mechanisms by which we collectively decide over the governance of how our data moves and what it's used for? And how can we do that in ways, and this is what we were really arguing for in that piece, is how can we do that in ways that don't generate sort of governing surpluses? They don't generate political surplus or policing surplus. So how can our data be collectively managed in a way that's purpose bound and not really be used for anything else, which is what undermines trust in governments, what undermines trust in corporate providers and such. And in the health context is one thing, and then moving on to the consumer internet, we also think that intermediaries have a part to play, because we need, so much of what we've been talking about in this series has been about trying to move away from the idea of consumers online exclusively as users of platforms, where the idea of a user is this kind of lingering pathological account of a resource that can be mined for data and attention. So how do we do that? Well, cooperatives and collectives online are a really interesting way of doing that, because they offer alternative mechanisms for genuine collective arrangements and self-governance. And we see creativity being a really critical thing, because this question, for what purpose are we collectivizing or forming an intermediary, is a really important one. And that's the one that we ask in a piece that I've co-written with Sebastian Benthal that's going to be in the AI Ethics and Society conference. For what purpose do we want to build an intermediary? And if it's genuine collective action and self-governance, that's really exciting, because we argue that control over data doesn't equal control over the governing power of data, and getting to that is really the critical thing for us.
Thanks, Jake. So there's two really interesting threads of thought, many interesting threads of thought coming out there, and threads that I know that Bronwen has thought and written about in a wider context. But so I think what we hear coming through from both Nathan and you, Jake, is this idea, there's two concerns. One is this push for democratization, so that more interest should be represented in the uses that are made of data, particularly since the value from data comes from its aggregation. It's not valuable in an individualized sense. It's valuable precisely for the fact that it's combined and used to make predictions, find insights about groups rather than individuals. And I guess the other thread that's coming through from this discussion is the idea that we can use this information for public goods, for health purposes, empowering consumers, developing different models of businesses that may go further than simply capturing attention for monetization of advertisers and platforms. So we can see that there's a focus on the data, but there's also a bigger aspiration for a different kind of market. And I think that's precisely where Bronwen's work comes in. Bronwen, can you talk to us a little bit about the work you've done on the attractions of these kinds of non-corporate or non-sort of investor-driven models of business?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really pleased to be here. So thank you for organizing this. And I was listening to this and thinking my entry point is different, and I think would give a slightly different angle to the question that Jeannie raised about transaction costs versus, if you like, the benefits of creativity beyond economic measurement. And that's partly because I feel the conversation has been more focused on, not entirely, and I know it's more nuanced than this, but the idea of data as the product or the service at an aggregated level, whereas I've actually come into it from a different angle, where it's the use of data and the digital infrastructure for delivering goods and services is now pervasive. So it's this question of developing these non-corporate structures could be applied specifically to how we house and data and deploy its uses for public purposes. But the more general drift, and I think Jeannie's point is getting to, is that the use of market vehicles is now imbricated with data and digital platforms at such a pervasive level that the question of how data is governed is going to come in much broader contexts than the specific thing of aggregated data for, say, health, or even in consumer internet and so on. And I've been starting to struggle with this in terms of, if you're doing empirical work, and I know both Nathan and I are interested in platform cooperatives. What is a platform cooperative? I mean, even if you identify, there are arguments about the cooperative form, which we could get to, but the question of, is a company with a website a platform? Probably not. Is Amazon a platform? Clearly, but there's a huge spectrum in between. And I think the question of transaction costs is much, and the importance of creativity, diversity, and pluralism is vitally important, particularly outside of that huge aggregated data type of focus. And for the same reason that I think we don't want an economy with just 2 supermarkets or just 4 banks. We don't want a monoculture of institutional structures available for conducting economic life. I don't even want to say conducting market. And there's a sort of, I suppose it's a competition law point in answer to transaction costs in some ways, but I think what we're all searching for here is a different language to articulate the creative benefits of that diversity of institutional form. And I can't resist just giving, well, actually, an illustration of the non-economic benefits of pluralism in corporate and non-corporate forms. This is a fairly extreme version, but I'm thinking it comes from a South African author called Graham Boyd, who writes about freeing the corporation almost as an existential thing, that the corporation in its mainstream form is in a sense a slave to investor interest as designed by its specific financial and legal infrastructure, and that creating diversity and pluralism in non-corporate form is actually an existential form of freedom for the legal person of the corporation. Now, I hadn't come quite to this angle of the legal person, the corporation before, but I think it's really interesting. Graham is actually South African, and I've often spoken to students about the importance of realizing that competition law has, non-economic transactional benefits in leveling the playing field and this goes back to Jake's introduction, sort of picking up on the importance of long historical patterns of inequity and colonization. And competition law in South Africa had aspirations to level the playing field between different racial groups in ways that transaction cost language just doesn't capture. So I think that's also a really important aspect of pluralism in organizational form.
Wow. The idea of freeing the corporate structure from its slavery to the profit motive has just been the first mind-blowing moment for me of the day, probably the week. So thank you for that. But it's it's fantastic. But it's a really important point, isn't it? Because when we look at that sort of narrower question of advertising to consumers or the market for attention, one of our concerns is about diversity, that we end up with this sort of, homogeneous beige coloured monotony where everybody's getting the same information or being promoted the same products. And there's a lot of discussion amongst, people who are interested in design and information systems about how we can prompt spontaneity and prompt diversity in those sorts of markets for attention. And Dana McKay, one of my colleagues, has done a lot of work in this. And I love that what we're really saying here is how do we have diversity at the market level so that antitrust starts to take on a whole new meaning in this field. Now, Nathan, we started with you. So before we move on to sort of some more specifics, I'm sure that you're dying to hop in here and comment on what's gone on, what this conversation or this part of the conversation. So back to you.
Well, thank you. I mean, I also really appreciate that intervention about liberating the corporation, and I just think it's really important to recognize how also constrained the cooperative model has been. In each of our societies, certain forms of cooperative business have kind of been unlocked in very, very targeted fashion. So in some ways, we've seen that kind of one-size-fits-allism. And it's something that frustrates me constantly as I'm working with cooperative founders, because there's a $130 billion cooperative bank down the road from me, but none of the tech co-ops I work with can use it because it was created through US policy to support farmers during the Great Depression, right? And so, and similarly, credit unions are constrained. Our cooperative banks you can get loans to set up cooperatives that are rural electric utilities, but you can't get the same loans to set up community solar arrays in urban or rural communities. The models in which shared ownership has been unlocked and enabled have been very, very narrow and kind of straitjacketed, to the point where to protect investors from having to face real competition from community-owned business. And so that historical legacy is something that makes me really eager to say, okay, if we're going to enable these kinds of models, we want to enable them as broadly and generally and creatively as we've already enabled investor ownership. If we're serious about community ownership being a real bulwark against the profit motive, we need to unleash it, and we need to create really generalizable models for enabling this stuff. So when I think about, okay, let's create some data cooperatives. My policy proposals around this stuff have said, let's not just focus on data cooperatives, let's focus on what all kinds of cooperatives need, and then data cooperatives will arise in the mix.
So that's a really also a really interesting response, Nathan, because you're reminding us of where we started in this series, which is the role of the law in effectively determining how power is distributed and exercised across the economy by the very by what it recognises as property, by how it defines and structures ownership. That's a big question. Let's just take it down to more of a micro level. We've been talking a lot about the cooperative structure. Now, I don't know what resonates in people's minds when they hear the word cooperative, other than a counter to the corporate model. When I was at university, I belonged to a food cooperative, but I'm equally reminded that some in Australia anyway, and in the US, dairy cooperatives have been around for a really long time and are a really good working example until recently, other story, of the cooperative structure fulfilling its function, but also, participating fully in the market economy. I'm going to stay with you, Nathan. Can we push you a little bit more to about ideas about cooperative structures or trusts, or I know you've spoken about a union model. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I'm always grasping for the right kind of tent that we need here, because for instance, in the United States, our most successful model for employee ownership has not been worker cooperatives. It's been the employee stock ownership plan, which is a trust-based structure, right? And I see them as linked movements. For data, again, I think there are some cases where a cooperative structure might work really well. Other cases where a trust or another kind of structure, a nonprofit, a foundation, might work really well. There's some ways in which the kind of things that we don't even have in the United States, like the Islamic concept of the Waqf, a kind of religious foundation, might be something we need to learn from. There are all kinds of models and structures we could consider. One frame that I've used the frame of shared ownership a lot. Another frame that Sarah Horowitz, who was the founder of the Freelancers Union here in the US, has been advocating is mutualism. I think I think it's important to, for the purposes of building a kind of a movement, a shared movement, to have terms that are both broad and encompass different legal structures. We don't want to get overly fixated on the legal structure necessarily, but we do want to be focused on the values and recognize, one value that I think is really important to center is creating commons as opposed to creating commodities. Cooperatives are one way to do that, but as we develop this discussion, I think it would be a mistake to think that there is a perfect legal structure. What we want is a set of goals and intentions, and use whatever legal structures we need in order to get there.
I think that's an important point, because you started with the diversity of models of contexts that we might be looking at, and I can imagine that participants in the sharing economy might be more interested in a model that allows them to have a voice and share in profits, where people who are interested in sort of promoting health outcomes might prefer a mutual model where they don't have to take operational decisions, but there's a collective aspect to what's done with data and the role of the entity that they're part of. So I think that's a really important point, that we shouldn't let the legal structures drive the output, but it should be a functional approach. Jake, I'm going to come back to you, because while you've also written about, I'm going to actually looking forward to hearing Christine's perspectives here shortly, because I know she's thought about some of these issues in regard to sustainability. But Jake, you're on our screen. So I wanted to ask you, you've talked about data cooperatives, but you've also talked about this idea of big tech as going to the top end of the market, or the big end of the market. You've talked about big tech as a public utility, and that's another possible mode of regulation because of course, at least in Australia, when we think about the regulation of electricity and water, and I would hope increasingly telecommunications, we put a lot of constraints on those providers in recognition of the fact that they are providing essential services. And so we expect them to, in fact, curb the profit motive, to be responsive to the diversity of needs of their users, and indeed to be making sure that people aren't excluded from the market, that they are allowed, that everybody in principle should have access to these essential services in a way that's commensurate with their means and needs. Do you think this idea of public utility has a role here, or is that just something that applies to social media, or can we use that more broadly?
All right, thanks. Well, there's a lot of things I want to comment on. Firstly, I want to remind everyone here that you should ask questions through the Q&A if things are coming up in your mind. So just organizational hat on for a moment. I'm still thinking about the existential freedom of the corporation, actually, which is a very interesting idea. But I also, and it reminds me of the work of David Siepley, who's wrote this really great sort of history of the corporation in a piece called The Wayward Leviathan for the Hedgehog Review. And his work is typically about that. And he talks about how corporations, started as these charter organizations with public purposes and then sort of devolved through this race to the bottom in corporate law towards having profit motive as their public purpose. But I do wonder, whether there's a qualitative categorical difference between organizations that encourage absenteeism in ownership versus active governance. And to me, a corporation participates in that. And while I think it's very good to think about the corporation as a unity rather than a nexus of contracts, it is a hierarchy and employees are a factor of production. And I wonder how much we can recuperate from the corporate form necessarily. And indeed, I'm sure there's a bunch of critical scholars here at the law school who would look at the role of the corporation historically and sort of and unpack some of its features, which I think would have relevance here. So my preference is to not necessarily move away from the corporate form, but to encourage diversity as much as possible. With respect to the public utility idea, so this is the idea that comes from people like Sabil Rahman, who have been writing about platforms as public utilities for a while. So it's a really complicated question. And in a piece for the Jane Family Institute publication, Phenomenal Worlds, I actually argued against the public utility idea on the basis that in a lot of ways, it maintains this, what I described before as pathological dimension of the digital economy, which is the treatment of individuals as users. And I think, there's such a diversity in public utility ideas, and we have to remember that a lot of them come out of the way in which we deregulate what were socialized services. So we had these socialized or nationalized telecommunication services, and then in order to fabricate a market for them, we had to put in place these sort of non-discrimination requirements and things like that. So in a lot of ways, what we think of as public utility regulations are part of a neoliberal program of marketization of social services. And so falling short of socialization, I'm iffy on public utility regulation. That said, the kernel of what I thought was interesting in the Australian News Media Bargaining Code proposal was that when it comes to regulating the relationship between content producers and platforms on the supplier side of that market, efforts to do that in Europe had relied on creating a property right and then hoping that that property right would somehow coordinate that relationship between the platform and the news organizations. And in Australia, the ACCC was like, well, there's too much doctrinal baggage associated with trying to fabricate a copyright here. Let's just require a pseudo rate setting arbitration mechanism. And it was getting close to rate setting that back end of the market. And that was the most promising dimension of it. And that is also sort of a kind of public utility type of regulation, I would think, as well. So in that case, you know, using the power of competition law to regulate those kinds of relations, I think is really could be really interesting and really useful. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, and that's my response.
Well, that's consistent with the emphasis that we've had on diversity, but also a beautiful lead into, again, Bronwen's work, because I know, Bronwen, you thought in a very actually holistic way about hybrid legal models, is I think the term you use, which takes us away from market paradigm, which borrow, I think, from different concepts of organisational structure, with a focus on the socially orientated goals and innovation. And importantly, I think you see that very linked to changing skill sets in individuals. So I know that's a big question for you, but can you talk a little bit more about your work in you know, from the hybrid to the professional?
Oh yeah, well, I could we might want to sequence it. I wouldn't mind just saying a little bit about, because I think there's a difference if you look through the prism of the organizational structure versus the sort of professional biography, if you like, the set of skills and the human pathway that came into designing that. And I think that part of what we can see opening up in really creative ways is more easily seen through the second, but it's worth a comment. I think just one more comment on the institutional diversity at the organizational level. And actually the difference between these two things was captured in a piece I wrote with Declan Kush a while ago. One of the things that we did, and he did this particular part, was a Twitter graph. I'm probably using the wrong technical language too, but it was a graphical representation of the way that people exchanged conversations and dialogue over hybrid institutions. And we did it through two ways. We did it through hashtags that looked at institutional form, and then hashtags that just tracked people. And it was really remarkable. Like, the diagram clustered very neatly. It absolutely illustrated Nathan's point, which is that the institutional constraints on cooperatives are maybe just as kind of monocultural as on corporations within the details of design of that form. So you had charity clusters, cooperative clusters, and corporation clusters. And this was just a sort of sample of conversations between many of the people we've been researching. But when you looked at it from a sort of the question of who was actually talking to who personally, it was a mess, but a creative and anarchically sort of productive mess as a diagram. And I think that follows in something I'll say later about professional biographies. But I think it's obviously also useful, and for transaction cost reasons, probably, to standardize the options and to give people, you know, a sense of a map of that diversity. And the way I've often thought of it, which might, I think, just be useful to throw into the conversation, is I actually had two categories, but I think that sort of leading into this seminar has made me think there are three, which is the two categories were structures that are more concerned with internal shared ownership and the democratization of process within the intermediary institution. And we've actually been focusing on that a lot more in this conversation. And then we've contrasted that a little bit to trust structures, which I think are in some ways as hierarchical as mainstream corporations, strongly led by investor finance, but obviously with an eye to a very different kind of beneficial purpose and a different legal vehicle of fiduciary, fiduciary duties come into both of those. But that trust is quite hierarchical in comparison to the democratization of the internal governance and shared ownership. But then, of course, there's a third structure, which actually I think has more institutional support, especially from the financial world, and more buzz around it, which is the social impact outcome, a hybrid structure. And so the whole question of I actually find it, I'm very excited that we've had a conversation where we're how many minutes in and we haven't mentioned social enterprise. Like, I think we're diversifying the conversation already by doing that. But there's a lot more work done between legal and financial architects, if you like, on social impact. And benefit corporations, I suppose, would be the sort of obvious example of one of those forms. But I think we could say a lot and debate a lot about the pros and cons of focusing on outcome and impact versus internal shared ownership. And again, versus this more hierarchical public purpose through the trust. Oh, I've lost
I
your
was just going to say, no, it was me. I was on mute. Somebody had to do it. No, I think that's fascinating because I'm interested. I did actually have social enterprise written in my notes, but and we also haven't talked about trust models. You're right, because I think that's entirely right. The trust is the taking away of control. Essentially, it's we'll look after things for you, and that has a purpose. Obviously, a very important purpose, particularly in charitable fields, for example. But if our interest is in democratization or perhaps incentivizing creativity, then that the trust model may not be agile enough for that, though it may have other functions elsewhere. So I think that's entirely right. We're going to turn to the panel shortly. There were two more things we kind of wanted to discuss on. So I might just ask Nathan, really almost as placeholders. Nathan, can you give us a comment on incentivizing individuals to participate in these sorts of new democratized structure? And then Bronwen, if we can come back to that comment about the changing nature of the professional in this model. And we'll just do that, and then we'll move to our panel, if that's okay. The panel, the rest of the participants, I mean. Go, yeah.
I mean, again, I think the question of incentive gets into, a broader regulatory framework. Because if our goal is simply to incentivize people with market-like pull, I think we're probably going to be in trouble because a lot of the things that we're talking about are things with longer-term benefits rather than shorter-term kind of attractions. And so it's yet another reason why I think it may be important in some contexts for there to be a kind of obligation or requirement for these kinds of structures. And I do think the public utility question is important. The question is really what layer we're talking about. For instance, there's a proposal now that's starting to move forward in California to require platform labor companies to contract with cooperatives. So rather than talking about data intermediaries, we're talking about labor intermediaries. So the cooperative manages the contracts between the workers and the platforms. And this still enables an open market of platforms, but it says, okay, this layer, the labor intermediary layer is one where we're going to create a kind of strong regulatory requirement, encourage some creativity, but there's a kind of expectation there. In other cases, I think there are possibilities of creating incentives where people will actually want to join these models. We've seen that with platform co-ops, for instance, around medical data in a couple of different types of models, where actually co-ops have been able to provide better deals for people. The problem is that co-ops don't have a strong financial access to capital, so it's harder for them to get going than the venture-backed startups. And so even though actually there would be an incentive if these companies were there for users to go to them, the problem is that they're being totally drowned out by their investor-backed competitors, so they need capital access that is in some way comparable. So in some case, so the answer is really both and. We need to recognize that in some cases there will be market incentives that will draw people. In other cases, we need to recognize, in some way paternalistically or democratically, that we need to carve out certain pieces of the market for where we want intermediaries to be obligatory, and where a utility framework might actually be appropriate.
Thank you. I think there's much to go on there, but Let's move to Bronwen, and then we can come back to pick up some of these ideas and the questions.
Okay, so yeah, this is just adding, I guess, that other angle on institutional diversity, which is how do you build them? What are the sort of professional skills and expertise that you need to do that? And basically, I mean, I could talk at more length with questions, but we had some interesting findings in the work I did with Declan Kush over years on this, and they mirror, I think Nathan's implicitly conveying that, you know, finance is a really hard piece of this, and I would say that the lawyers are the other really challenging piece. So we did an analysis, which I won't go into, but we looked at LinkedIn biographies. It's a really interesting way to because I was finding the people who were most adept at building these hybrid institutions started to, at first I would look at their pathways and think, what is that? Is that a career? But, you know, we ended up with typologies of really creative, you might call it like a bricolage kind of career. And the pathways that were quite vital in this respect were not lawyers or financiers. They were engineers, designers, architects, computer software programmers, especially ones with a hacking sensibility, and certain combinations of sustainability and arts backgrounds and education. And those people, when you put them in teams, could design and actually design institutions really well. But ultimately, when you have to sort of formalize the institution and go out and raise capital, as Nathan says, then you are faced with law and finance being really crucial. And there we had people, I mean, the interesting thing is there we had a lot of people in the space who'd come out of the market, out of large-scale corporations, who one of them called themselves a corporate refugee, and that was a phrase we ended up using, that they really wanted to deploy their skills to more creative intent with greater public purpose. But the institutional models that they were working with were almost too ingrained to depart from. So they actually had more struggle with the institutional creativity than the other professions that I talked about. And but there were lots of them, lots coming out of the corporate world on the finance side, but not struggling to find creative models. While on the other hand, there were hardly any lawyers coming out. It was really remarkable. And the ones that were coming into this space were mostly trying to stop being lawyers, which I thought was quite interesting. And I think, you know, this is just to throw it into the mix. There's something important about sustainability and ecological transformation. I mean, it was the context of my research, but where people were trying to restructure the fundamentals of the economic engine in a way that properly recognizes this immense sustainability and ecological challenges that we face, they were more able to design true diversity. But if they were sort of hooked onto the models that are causing the damage ecologically, and this was most strong in finance, then you would get this ill fit between the background skills and expertise. So the corporate refugees, if you like, were available but a bit lost, whereas all these designers and architects and engineers, you know, could carve a pathway, but they needed the lawyers and the finance people. So there's some really great work by an organization called R3.0, which is regenerative, is the third level of the R's. And they talk about positive mavericks in different professional settings, and actually develop quite concrete ways of supporting professionals who kind of self-identify as positive mavericks to work within mainstream professional trajectories to start to create the ecosystem and the tent that Nathan is talking about that will be more attuned to public purpose, but ecological possibilities of transformation as well.
Thanks so much, Bronwen. So there we go, positive mavericks. That's an interesting contribution to the discussion, because we've talked a lot about structures that might be available in contrast to traditional market capitalism. We've talked about different purposes driving those structures, but in terms of the purposes, up to now, we've talked mainly, I think, about democratization and creativity, but you're reminding us that there's sort of outward-facing purposes as well, and that those sort of altruistic or existential beliefs may in fact be one of the main drivers of change, and they're not incompatible with, of course, the idea of democratization. And so what's important is both the structure and the individuals that can create those models, by both being incentivized to participate and being prepared to apply their creativity to creating new forms and persuading those in the traditional market to take them seriously. I'm sure we've got lots more to say, but I'd love to bring in our expert panel that I can see on the screen sitting waiting. So I'm not sure if we need to change our screen to do that. But I'm just wondering if Christine, Kim, Jenny or Julian would like to jump into the conversation at this point. Go for it. Or raise your hand and I'll ask your question. You're all very polite.
Okay, well, I'll jump in then.
Thank you, Kim.
I'll be the least polite. I actually want to follow up that last point about the kinds of skills and the kinds of people that we can get doing these things, as well as that, married purpose. Because one of the things that I think, I've been involved, I'm a lawyer trained, I've been involved in plenty of policy discussions, and a lot of these discussions do occur between sort of government and law and finance and business. And I've found in those rooms, people do struggle to think about how we integrate these other models, how we do things communally. The question of sort of communal ownership and communal groups barely seems to enter the room in that context. So I'm wondering how we make that leap, how we not only sort of engender these sorts of organisations, get these people together, but how we also get them into some of the rooms that are making these decisions about the legal framework, or do we not need to?
I wrote a paper coming out of the Future Fellowship research called "Where are the Community Enterprise Lawyers?", which I suppose with Joanne McNeil and Isabel Blomfield, and that was identifying that unmet need, in a sense, that you're articulating, and some of the support pathways and gaps that could be supported to do that. Because as Nathan also mentioned earlier, these alternative forms do have it's not only just a regulatory framework that's supportive, but a sort of ecosystem of capacity support, I think, that matters. Getting those community enterprise lawyers into the rooms is another thing, a step again. I mean, I've spent quite a lot of time on the, I think it was called the Social Enterprise Legal Models Working Group. And we were trying to get those rooms to happen. And the one question which is really hard is which government department? So we would have conversations with Treasury, which, I mean, Treasury, I think, was the department that led the sort of drift away from multiple, towards a sort of more focus on the national corporation as a relative monoculture. So it wasn't, and it was concerned about the transaction costs that Jeannie raised at the beginning. But then we were with social services for a while, and that was just really a gap too far to cross because their mindset was regulatory in a very deep way. So I suppose it's a long game. But I think it's a long game with massive potential for young people. And that's the bit that I feel like is really important and exciting.
Yeah, I wonder too, this is all making me think about all of the different, grant schemes and support schemes that are around startups and the kinds of support that we build around those, or the government builds around those. It's like, we'll create a startup hub and we'll provide you with some finance people and some law people and some joint venture people. But where are the people who are like, how about the design people or the ecological sustainability people or the how to build a social purpose and bring people along with you people?
No, you're absolutely right. I just remembered that I was part of a group called Sydney Commons Lab, which last year ran an event with the City of Sydney on community wealth building, which we haven't mentioned, but it's another interesting model going beyond institutional intermediaries to a sort of ecosystem of shared ownership. And after that, the 4 universities, we had people from UTS, Western Sydney, UNSW and Sydney, and we talked about trying to run a regenerative economy hackathon. And I think I've got a meeting about it next week, but that's exactly actually what you're alluding to. I don't know if we'll get there because the inter-institutional turf sensitivities are not easy to transcend.
I'm going to actually move to the question that's come up, because I think this is at the heart of something we all should be interested in and reflect on. There's a lot of discussion about creativity and democracy in precisely this field that Kim is talking about, which is the sort of techie startup space, dare I say woke. My children would shoot me. But the question that's asked, I think, goes to the genuineness of this issue of who's in control and who gets to speak. And the question is this, I think you can see it, but I'll read it out. Can each of the speakers reflect on the challenge of progressive movements, academia, social enterprise, platform cooperatives, replicating existing patterns of domination, oppression, and exclusion? A lot of Black, brown, queer, trans people are more than capable, but will never be able to sustain careers, or I'd say even participate in the conversation that we're occupying. And actually, this was something I know Nathan had raised when we were planning this discussion. So Nathan, can I ask you to reflect on that question or comment at first, and then we'll go to the other panelists.
Yeah, thank you so much for raising that point, because this question of inequality is really central, particularly if we adopt a framing around digital colonialism, which puts what we're talking about in the context of a longer pattern of extraction and oppression, which I think is really appropriate in many contexts. There's so much to explore about this question. It's something I'm currently working on a paper on around and a broader research project around digital colonialism in the context of this stuff. But just to reflect back on the last topic around building spaces of support. An example I've been really grateful to be part of is Start.coop, which is an accelerator specifically designed for cooperatives and really focused on the digital economy in a lot of contexts. And we've succeeded. It wasn't the case at first, but we've really succeeded in making a lot of progress toward focusing our energy on marginalized founders, and a lot of that comes from just a lot of intentionality at every step of the way. Who are our mentors? Who are our what kinds of goals are we focusing on? Who are the investors and what do they want? Asking at every step with every stakeholder, what are you trying to build and how are we making sure to center those who have been marginalized? And for instance, that produces different business models. So one data cooperative that has gone through our accelerator, the driver's seat cooperative, has built a business model not around putting organizations out of business and demolishing, for instance, unionized jobs, but actually building a model around supporting unions by connecting gig worker data and making it accessible to worker organizations. So when we build our accelerators and support infrastructures differently to center other kinds of people than the mainstream models have centered, we're also creating space for different kinds of business models with very different kinds of outcomes. So it's a hard challenge. It requires persistence at every step of the way. But when we do that intentionally, we can really produce very different kinds of outcomes. Again, thank you for the question.
Jake, did you want to comment there?
I mean, Nathan's answer was really terrific, and I don't really have too much to add beyond that, except to say that this question sort of highlights my preference in intermediary design towards community-based collectives rather than sort of corporate models, because there seems to me space for genuine community purposes to drive the formation of these kinds of organizations. And in that case, you know, you might get intermediaries or collectives or co-ops that are organized around principles like mutual aid and things like that, which is something that is theoretically or potentially more inclusive than participation in a capitalist market economy, which is always racialized in one way or another. So I mean, I don't have a good answer for that question, but it's a really important one. Yeah.
And maybe I can just add to, I also support very much what Nathan says. And Jake's comment makes me really think, yes, that the typology I had before about social impact and outcome as one mode of hybrid institution drifts very quickly towards measurement and metrics as the kind of indicia of progress. And those are, as opposed to the participatory one, of small-scale initiatives would link to things which I think is getting away from the institutional scripts which reproduce domination on the one hand, but also staying alive to the human element about who is involved and exactly in a very sort of human identity way, who is on the table, at the table. And those two things have to constantly be in collaboration with each other, because if you involve a whole lot of people that is more inclusive, but reproduce institutional scripts that are going to systemically reproduce the patterns over time, then you won't get anywhere. So they both have to be in the mix.
Okay, can you guys hear me? Because my screen has now frozen.
You can hear you.
Great. Christine had a question, then Julian.
Yes, thanks, Jeannie. And thanks to Nathan and Bronwen, and also Jake for your excellent, thoughtful contributions. I wanted to make a comment or a question that I think is complementary to what we were just discussing. Now, so this is a completely unscientific observation, but I sit here sort of listening, and this all sounds so lovely. And Bronwen's just raised the question about what some people call scaling out of these tiny little models. And I think the thing that's coming into my head is, you know, I look at Amazon and the Facebook and so on, and we have these sort of American, US, white alpha males, cult of personality type corporate behemoths running the culture here. And we're sort of talking about whether a cooperative model or whatever it is, how it stacks up against a corporate legal structure. But the logic of domination, the power that we're talking about is using the corporate legal structure, but it's not contained by that. So I sort of, it starts making me feel very uncomfortable that we don't really know how to contain this power. And some things that were coming into my mind as you were talking was, you know, we do have a lot of legal and democratic institutions that try to make corporations, if you just take that very simple model of a corporation that we've been assuming of a bunch of shareholders and a board and employees, we've got a lot of laws about corporate governance. And then if we expand our view, we've got a whole ecology of law and regulation that applies to these corporations. So we have laws about worker health and safety, proper pay, diversity, discrimination, environmental regulations, and so on. And like, if they all worked perfectly and kept going in the right direction, a lot of what a corporation did would look like the kind of things that you're talking about. But we don't have that. We have corporate groups based in the US with, layer upon layer of companies owning companies, and then going back to some individual somewhere, lobbying US Congress so that even somebody like Obama, passes all these laws that help them to do worse things. And arbitrage between countries and so on, so that when we try to do something okay in Australia, they'll just threaten to leave and go somewhere else. Anyway, I got very depressed, basically. And so it's a bit more of a comment, but I really like the fact that Bronwen sort of brings it back to, well, we need to encourage people who have the professional biography and skills to start looking for the ways that you can build something different that actually somehow changes the structure, through some form of sociological agency, legal agency, design agency, and so on. Anyway, sorry, my question's trailing off, but I think you know what I'm saying. So it's more of a cry of despair, and maybe you've got some hope there somewhere.
So I'm going to jump in first, because I think, Christine, your question and the previous question I read out sit really well together, because of course we're talking about these structures, against the monolith of a, quite aggressive transnational capitalist model. And I think it's really important, and we have these conversations, to start with the point that I think Nathan made, that we're not saying there's one solution. We're presuming attention, funded regulators, attention on antitrust and the like. And I think your point is your comment and question have just told us precisely why we can't throw out the regulatory model as well. And Nathan, did you want to respond first, and Bronwen and Jake? Or shall we sit in our existential horror at the world before us?
I'll sit with the horror for now.
I do want to just say a short thing. I mean, I feel like Christine just described backwards why I sort of moved into this space. It's like, I suppose you go in cycles, but I felt and still feel all of what you described, but that is what in part has energized and motivated me to study this. And I think, maybe this seems too apple pie, but there's a sort of a consciousness shifting. And I don't mean that at an individualistic level. I mean the collective process of engaging in these practices at a small scale is consciousness shifting in the same way that I feel like feminism was over. And, the sort of the small conversations around the kitchen tables in the homes of women who were frustrated. And I know that feminism, the achievements of feminism are massively limited at an intersectional level. So I don't want to underplay that at all. But with a greater intentionality and consciousness about the first question about not replication, domination of the patterns, I think there's hope in consciousness changing practices that if they're embodied, and embodied now with data is so, embodied in the sense of sort of being brought into practice and conversation with practice and building actual institutions and not just commenting on them. I think that does change things. But then again, as Jeannie says, it's not all that we need. And these positive mavericks that are working in the large institutions, if they can, have more conversations with, with the more edge work that's being done on the niches. That's just all that can be done. But plus the big protest movements. I suppose that's the other thing I was thinking with the other is that, the big protest movements that are saying no to some of the worst. It's linking up what saying no means with what saying yes could mean after that. I know that's it's not enough, but that's all I have.
Jake, did you want to say a word, or you're?
I mean, not a long word. I'll just say that the conditions that you describe mean that like the individual can really only stand in a certain number of social relations to a platform, right? You're a user, or you're an employee, or something else. And I suppose the thing that makes me think that intermediaries or organizations that sit between individuals and things like platforms are important, because it seems to me that because of the sort of superordinate power and rationality of these organizations, the individual is never really able to understand or pursue their own interests in their relationship with these organizations. And that's, to me, the foundational point behind why intermediaries are important.
Thanks, Jake. Now I'm going to go back to our attendee who made the comment about oppression, who also makes the point that I have been painfully aware of as we have spoken, that we need to diversify panels going forward and allow Black, Brown authors to write about data and colonialism, and also a variety of authors to write about these issues. So I cannot but say that is a point well made, and we're all acknowledging and reflecting on that comment. So thank you. And also to our anonymous, and I hope autonomous attendee, please feel welcome. I would love it if you wanted to email us with suggestions for a panel on digital data colonialism. We can do that, or if you have suggestions of people you'd like to hear speak, I think that would be a really worthwhile contribution to this debate. So thank you for your tolerance and patience with this panel. I'm going to move now to Julian, who has a question, and then we'll move back to some of the questions that have been raised by our attendees.
Thanks very much, Jeannie. Really just a quick comment, I suppose, following these observations, just, I suppose, noting that, in Australia, we also, of course, have a long history of associationalism and a lot of stories of extraordinary innovation around the creation of organisations and institutions for precisely the sorts of reasons that Jake and others have been talking about. And I would say that many of the most inspiring examples of those come from Australia's Indigenous sector. And that when we're thinking about the complexity of these issues, the fact that the sorts of organisations we're talking about, whether they're sort of social enterprises or corporations of different kinds, cooperatives, we see that full diversity in Australia's Indigenous sector in the history there, and that ecology has achieved an enormous amount. So when we're talking about how those kinds of organisations can work towards extraordinarily ambitious and important social goals, such as the creation of an Indigenous digital economy or digital media system in this country, I think it will be really interesting to see how this plays out over the next decade or so. We've talked a little bit about how important what the role of governance and regulation, the creation of metrics in this sort of area, and that has really driven, I think, the remarkably important work of the Coalition of Peaks in Australia, led by Pat Turner. And I think what they are trying to do is actually reconfigure relations between the sorts of sectors we're talking about and government in very inventive and important new ways, which I think should give us cause for, you know, considerable optimism as well as concern, clearly, about what we see going on elsewhere in the corporate or government sector here or anywhere else. So I suppose that's just a brief comment, but you know, just to point out that we're seeing this playing out in action right now, where a remarkable network of Indigenous organisations is really taking control of the policy agenda in this space for that very important part of our country. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Julian. I think that your comment is very pertinent and also leads into a question from the audience. So I'll ask that, and then I'll ask the panelists to comment. Serene asks, she says, I work in the area of, they say, I work in the area of land rights and land formalism in developing countries where there is a push to use new technologies driven by donors and insisting on bottom-up approaches. This clashes with state structure since land ownership is highly regulated. This is an emerging space in this sector. And can each of the speakers suggest areas we should pay attention to given their experiences in this sort of tension between formal and legal structures about land and a push to use new technologies to control and distribute that land? I think it's the question. Bronwen?
Oh, I'm just trying to, I'm wondering whether to ask for, I mean, the thing that comes to mind, and this may not gel with what the speaker was thinking of at all, but is some of the use of blockchain to trace carbon capture within soils and then reward land managers for that soil. But I don't know if that's, or is it the digital titling of land, which, you know, New South Wales has now privatized its land titles office, and we're about to issue fully electronic titles, apparently the first in the world to do that. So is it, I mean, if that's the sort of thing that's meant, I suppose the more general capacity of digital technology of the particular participants who tend to control the resources and decision-making processes around automation, especially at scale, are often not attuned to the needs of people who are otherwise being shut out of the economic system. So there needs to be sort of inclusion at a step back. I mean, I feel very concerned that even at the level of cities, we seem to be almost assuming that large-scale digital platform design will be done by the private sector. So I suppose some form of capacity building plus really committed procurement, social procurement that pays primary attention to historical inequities would go some way towards redressing that. But the use of the digital both scales and speeds up patterns of change in and around land ownership, so it sounds concerning. But I don't know that if I'm speaking to the specificities of what the question.
Nathan?
Yeah, I think, you know, for me the challenge is to recognize that the digital and land have never been separate, right? And that we need to challenge ourselves to better integrate how we think about the online and the offline, to recognize that our data centers are on land, and access to certain places enables access to digital economies, and in turn that these economies are helping to shape, as Bronwen has been saying, how we govern and imagine land. And for both, I think we need to cultivate a much more strident commons language and approach. one that is, in conversation and led by Indigenous communities in many cases, who where there's a deeper understanding of the commons than in settler colonial communities who've built their lives and livelihoods around eliminating commons. And at the same time, recognizing ways in which digital economies have actually rekindled commons through things like open source software and other forms of peer production, and to, in both sites, have a rejuvenation of a recognition of the possibility of common holding, common, I don't want to say property, but common governance. And to recognize that as we work to design the kind of entrepreneurial and innovation economies of the future, that we may intentionally build them to create commons, as has been so successful in so many aspects of the digital economy, but which private corporations have fought, tooth and nail. I think today about, this week, our government, was dragged into supporting an exemption on the patents for the COVID vaccines, right? That the framework of focusing on a IP-driven regime for the vaccines was driven by the Gates Foundation. Bill Gates made his money actively fighting open source software and free software, even despite the fact that now his company has embraced those methodologies in pretty remarkable ways. All this is to say that we need to recognize the opportunity at every turn to build commons rather than private wealth.
Thanks. Jake, did you want to comment there?
Yeah, no, I would just add that, I mean, that's a really sensible and sort of beautiful sentiment. And that, when you're using cadastral systems to abstract land into rights and then abstract those rights into more property rights, you have to just be wary of the reality that a lot of that's used for financialization and other things that are not necessarily going to benefit the people who have used the land beforehand. And so the question was, what do you pay attention to when you're developing digital systems for land management? I was like, oh, well, that strikes me as the thing that you need to pay attention to.
Thanks, Jake. And Serene comments that asking comments, I think that also should we be asking communities who are digitally illiterate to be co-producers, which I think is a pertinent comment, and perhaps shows we're asking, when we move into those communities, we're asking the wrong questions. I have a comment here. First of all, Jenny, did you have a comment? You've actually been typing rapidly. Did you want to just comment with some of the resources that you've shared for us? Or
so hi. So thank you first to all the speakers. This has been a really interesting conversation, especially I think once as the panelists and the audience has come in, and I think it's taken a really interesting especially critical turn that is an important conversation we need to have. I don't have personal thoughts so much to add, but I have been sharing a few resources through the chat that pertain to this discussion of structural inequality, intersectional inequality, and data economies, in particular, data capitalism. One of the pieces that I shared was Tressie McMillan-Kodum, who is a critical race theorist and technology theorist who's written about this intersection of platform capitalism and racism. And then sort of on the more practical side, I've shared a link to Data for Black Lives, which is sort of a ground up, pretty widely known organization that trains people living in affected communities, mostly people of color, in data science so that they can sort of bolster autonomy and ownership from within. And so I don't have so much to add, so much as my appreciation for their works and their intersection with what we're talking about here. And these are in particular works by scholars and activists of color, which I think speaks to some of the issues we've been and challenges that we've been confronting here today.
Thanks so much, Jenny. And we will share those resources with the recording, which you'll be able to find on the website for the Centre of Excellence. I think that we are coming to an end, so it's probably appropriate to thank our speakers, and I'm going to hand over to Jake in just a second to say a few words, but I just wanted to note, for those of you who can see the Q&A, Fleur has made a comment. They've asked, is hope essential? And maybe there's political reasons to try and bracket the necessity of hope as commonly articulated, and instead pro possibilities associated with modes of thought, action, feeling, often derided as forms of stuckness or destructiveness, which I think very well summarises some of this discussion. So thank you, Fleur. I now hand over to Jake to wind things up and tell us what's coming next.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you so much to everyone, to all the panelists and to the audience who made really good questions and important points with respect to the topic that we've been discussing, but also our own organizational thinking around it. And I especially want to thank Bronwen and Nathan. This has been really fascinating, interesting, and I think quite a unique take on something that's been discussed relatively broadly, and I think that your approaches really have expanded the ways that we can think about this and the things that we can attend to when in our future thinking. So thank you so much again. Just before we go, I just want to tell everyone about the fourth and final seminar in this series that will be happening on Thursday, the 20th of May. The theme for that is governance, data for governance, and our speakers include Professor Karen Jung from the University of Birmingham. We'll be talking about the use of data in the public sector and an idea that she calls new public analytics. And Peter Lucas Jones, who is from Tahiku Media and Maori Television, talking about the Maori natural language translation program that he stewarded in New Zealand. So hopefully we'll see you all there. I see that the registration link has just been put into the chat, so I'll give you a second before we close the seminar for you to just click on that and bring up the website for the registration. But thank you everyone so much, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.